Again, just talking about chiasmus, this question of whether or not a particular chiasm was accidentally created or if it was intentionally created. Because a lot of critics of the Book of Mormon, and again, as I was doing the paper, I dug into this, they found chiasmus in like green eggs and ham.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right, that's a classic. They found chiasmus in some of like Emma Smith's letters, in like an Informix online database guide.
Even in the DNC.
In the DNC, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we've discovered chiasmus everywhere, but no reputable scholar would walk up to, like, say, a Jewish scholar of the Hebrew Bible and say, look, I found chiasmus in green eggs and ham, therefore all the chiasms in the Hebrew Bible are invalid and not intentional. It's just all accidental. So the question is not whether chiasms exist or not. The question is whether they are intentional or not.
Welcome to an exclusive interview here, hosted by yours truly, Zach Wright. I'm here today with Dr. Carl Cranney, and I'm really excited for this specific episode because as I was going over the article we're going to be talking about today, I just thought to myself, I know that I want to be able to talk with this guy about this. And when I heard that you wanted to come in and do an interview about the specific paper, I was really, really excited because I was like, oh, pick me. I want to be able to, I want to talk to this, Yale-trained theologian. But I was going to give you a little bit of time to introduce yourself here first before we kind of launch into it, if that's okay.
Well, sure. Hi, my name is Carl Cranney. I have a PhD in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America, and I did my master's work at Yale, as you mentioned. Oddly enough, none of that really affects the paper itself that we're going to be discussing today. It was just something that I noticed as I was studying and reading the Book of Mormon. And then I got my brother to do all the statistical analysis because he's the one who can do that sort of stuff. But there's not a lot of theology in this paper, but it is something that I noticed that I think is of use to those who are looking and trying to understand the Book of Mormon. So anyway, that's a little bit about my background and also how it's slightly irrelevant to the topic of conversation today, but that's all right.
Right. Well, I pride myself in bringing up irrelevant tangents. And so the thing I wanted to bring up specifically to kind of lead into the paper, because we're going to talk a lot about chiasmus today. Mm-hmm. And I think you're pulling from a lot of different papers, and we're going to be talking about how some of these chiasms are used intentionally in the Book of Mormon. Would you be able to talk about that a little bit?
Well, sure. But first of all, I want to make a slight correction that I hope everybody listening to this video takes to heart. You should never mention the word chiasmus in relationship to the Book of Mormon without also mentioning that it is only one of, depending on how you're counting, I'm going to use Donald Perry's work, one of 25 different kinds of Hebrew parallel poetry that exists in the Book of Mormon. We talk about chiasmus a lot. Dr. Welch, obviously, who I used to work for a long time ago as one of his assistants, discovered it on his mission. It's been the source of many books and chapters and papers and things. There was even a conference at BYU a couple years ago on chiasmus. But I think we do ourselves a disservice when we focus so much on just this one kind of poetry, when in reality it is only one of 25 kinds of poetry. And it may be the most complicated and maybe even the richest, but we won't even be able to understand whether it is the richest and whether it is the most complicated if we never look at the other 24. So yes, we're going to talk about chiasmus, but we're also I'll just use Dr. Perry's work here. Sorry if I can get to
it. While you're looking that up, one thing I will say is that I've certainly fallen into that trap, right? Where I sometimes use the term chiasm just to refer to like different poetry forms in general.
Right. Yes.
And
it becomes kind of like how Kleenex is a brand name, but we call all of those things Kleenexes.
Right.
Or rollerblade. Like there's a couple of where the brand name itself becomes synonymous with all devices or things of this type. And chiasmus has turned into that, even though
Right.
they're very, like I found it here. I'll just read the first couple of his glossary of poetic forms. These are the 25 different kinds of poetry he's found in the Book of Mormon. There's antithetical parallelism. There's chiasmus. There's contrasting ideas, detailing, duplication, extended alternates, extended synonymous, extended synthetic parallelism, gradation parallelism, and on and on and on and on. He's got, there's a lot more going on here than just this one form. So that's part of what my paper is about.
Right. And in the kind of background section, you cite a lot of Perry's work. You talk about John Welch's work and how he discovered it on his mission. And that's just a really cool story in and of itself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But
there's a whole BYU Studies article about that that has like a great piece of artwork. And I was wondering, what would it be like to have a central point of my life depicted by an artist, because it was that important and influential to so many people through the rest of my church. Dr. Welch's story is pretty amazing and quite inspiring, really.
Yeah. No, I can certainly get behind that. But that kind of leads into the main point of your paper. Because if I recall correctly, it talks a lot about how it's intentionally used in the Book of Mormon, or how these poetry forms are intentionally used. Because one of the criticisms that is often brought up in regard to some of this scholarship is, oh, well, those are just kind of put in there accidentally. Or Joseph Smith is making this up, and if he's making this up and he's pulling from kind of like the biblical style, if you will, then it would be completely normal to find chiasms in the Book of Mormon. But I think your paper kind of directly responds to those kinds of accusations. And so I'd be interested to hear you kind of talk a little bit about the overall purpose of your paper and kind of what you found. So
sure. So the genesis of my paper came when I was an undergraduate just reading the Book of Mormon. I found, and I have my copy of it here, my old dog-marked copy of Dr. Perry's poetic parallelisms in the Book of Mormon, where he takes the Book of Mormon and reformats the text. So it's all just the same words, but reformats it in a visual manner so you can see the parallelisms more clearly. So if he has an AB, the first shall be last and last shall be first, right? That's a very simple chiasm, A, B, B, A. Yeah. First, last, last, first. He indents it so you see visually first, last, last, first. It just helps you sort of visually get a sense for the poetry and what's going on. And as I was reading this copy of the Book of Mormon, I noticed that there are some pages where there's it's very busy visually. There's a lot going on. There's multiple different kinds of poetry, sometimes poetry embedded within the poetry. And then there are some pages where it's just normal text, where it just looks like a normal book or a novel or a paper or something. And I was like, that is why are some parts of the Book of Mormon so busy with poetry and other parts are just text? And I was thinking about that. And so I decided to see if I could find where that pattern existed. If we could find out why some parts have poetry and some parts do not. And it was only as I started working on the project that I realized that other people have done this. Again, just talking about chiasmus, this question of whether or not a particular chiasm was accidentally created or if it was intentionally created. Because a lot of critics of the Book of Mormon, and again, as I was doing the paper, I dug into this, they found chiasmus in like green eggs and ham.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right, that's a classic. They found chiasmus in some of like Emma Smith's letters, in like an Informix online database guide.
Even in the DNC.
In the DNC, yeah. Mm-hmm. So we've discovered chiasmus everywhere, but no reputable scholar would walk up to, like, say, a Jewish scholar of the Hebrew Bible and say, look, I found chiasmus in green eggs and ham, therefore all the chiasms in the Hebrew Bible are invalid and not intentional. It's just all accidental. So the question is not whether chiasms exist or not. The question is whether they are intentional or not. Because you can accidentally create them. that doesn't mean they are all accidentally created. And then when you take that out, because I'm violating my own principle here, we're talking about chiasmus. When you take it out to the level of the Book of Mormon as a whole and look at chiasmus and the other 24 kinds of poetry, the situation becomes a little more complicated in trying to determine whether there is intentional usage of this poetry or if it's accidental generation of this poetry.
Right. I was going to read a quick quote, kind of in conjunction with that, but I really think it brings your point home. It's from an Interpreter article done by Noel Reynolds, where they're talking again specifically about Alma 36, which is an example of chiasmus.
Which is probably the most complicated moment of Hebrew poetry in the entire Book of Mormon that happens to be a chiasmus, yes.
Right. So, just very quick. Some of the criticism directed at Welch's analysis of Alma 36 may have assumed the principles of Hebrew rhetoric mentioned above are rules that provide templates into which a writer was expected to force his text. So again, saying that it has to match up with one specific form, but not only that, but also it has to follow it exactly, like ABC and CBA. And if
any
deviation from that,
it's no good.
But Reynolds goes on to say that would be a serious misunderstanding. Rather, the leading studies of Hebrew rhetoric have identified patterns or rhetorical principles they have found in use a wide variety of adaptations by different authors. But these authors obviously felt free to use those principles or patterns creatively to help them express the content of their writings. So, again, going back to this idea that it doesn't have to be, exactly perfect per se. What matters more is this intentionality aspect that you're referring to, where these writers in the Book of Mormon would use these principles as a way to...
Or the Old Testament.
Or the Old Testament,
Bible, New Testament, right, yeah.
So when these principles are used, though, they're used in the context of being able to... I like the point of your paper is like being able to remember things and being able to remember in these oral texts, but also just to be able to communicate points. And that intentionality aspect matters far more than a strict adherence to the form itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, it's poetry. If there's any form of literature, I think, that worldwide has rules, but you are certainly allowed to fudge them, it would be poetry. So just
like the
that
pirate code, right?
That's right. They're more like guidelines. Yes. That's a good insert.
Thank you.
There. Yeah.
Again, useless tangents. But no, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, that's certainly you're allowed. If there's anything where you're allowed to sort of fudge things and just do what works, it would be poetry, first of all. But the kinds of parallel poetry that we're talking about from the Hebrew tradition here do have, and you mentioned this very briefly, a specific purpose in mind as far as we can tell, and that is to facilitate oral delivery of complicated messages.
And there's a lot of that in the Book of Mormon, for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. And so kind of getting into the methodology for my paper, I was trying to figure out, so we have this whole book, and there are some pages that are just text, and there are some pages that have lots of poetry, and how do we figure out, what's going on and where? How would we look at this and try to find a pattern? And I eventually realized that what we had in the Book of Mormon, the best way to approach sort of that question would be to pull out all of the embedded documents, because there are various places where there is a clear moment where it shifts from usually Mormon as the editor, and he says, I'm just going to stick this thing in that is from Alma's own record in his speeches to his sons, right? And so we know that Mormon is no longer the author here. He is taking a previously existing document and sticking it into the Book of Mormon. And so I thought, okay, this is kind of a small category. I mean, there's enough pages that I think we get some statistically valid sampling, but this is a category where I could pull out all of the embedded documents and see if within those embedded documents there are patterns to the poetry. I started doing that, and what I discovered is if you pull out all these embedded documents, there are, I think, 21 of them, and there are a couple that almost made the cut. King Benjamin's sermon, oddly enough, did not make the cut. because there's just a few reasons why it's not entirely clear that it is just lifted from King Benjamin's like royal archives or whatever and just stuck into the Book of Mormon. It's integrated into the flow of the narrative more than some of the other documents where Mormon's just like, here's this letter from, Pahoran. Chunk. He just sticks it in. And so I came up with this list of documents, and then I sort of categorized them by, we'll call it genre. I don't know if that's quite the right term, but basically there ended up being 4 genres. There are sermons, there are narratives, there are letters, and there is there's one narrative and there's one proclamation. So sermons, letters, proclamation, and a narrative. And so those are sort of the 4 categories that I was able to create looking at what these embedded documents were and the purpose they originally served. And so then I just went and I said, okay, let's just look at how much poetry is in these embedded documents.
And how many examples were you able to find?
I think it was 21.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And so I looked at all of those and tried to see if there was some kind of pattern, and it turns out that there is. The sermons, which are clearly oral moments in the Book of Mormon, are chock full of poetry. And the narrative, the proclamation, and the letters are not. There is some in all of them, but if you line all of these up, so the test that I used was basically taking Dr. Perry's work just at face value. If there is any portion of a verse that has some kind of Hebrew poetry, because the verses don't match up with his recreation of the poetic patterns perfectly, but if there was any portion of the verse that had part of Hebrew poetry in it in one of these parallel forms, I counted it as like a 1, and if it didn't, it was a 0. You just do the percentages that way. And it turns out that all of the letters, starting with some of the back and forth between like the Gadianton robber leaders and the Nephite leaders during the Amalekite Wars. There's a tongue twister for you, right? It's oddly enough, it's the former Nephites who are now leading the Lamanites, writing letters back and forth to the chief judge. Some of theirs have 0%. There's no poetry in them at all the way up to some of the sermons that have like 80s. Oh, well, I'd have to look at the number right here.
But I remember, I know some of the letters that you're talking about. So another example would be Moroni's letter to Pahoran, right? And he's basically threatening to, go back and march his armies back and like overthrow Pahoran, basically. Yeah.
So there's all these different letters and things. If you line the various embedded documents up in order of what percentage of them had a parallelized verse, I hope that makes sense. You start with the letters. There's one proclamation in the middle. And then it's all sermons, and the narrative itself is at the very bottom of the sermons. And so basically, everything that was written down has a low percentage of Hebrew poetry. Everything that was for oral delivery has a high percentage of Hebrew poetry. And I had realized that I had discovered that there is a way to quantify this pattern that just seems to exist visually as you flip through Dr. Perry's work, that the poetry shows up in specific places, and those places are when they're trying to deliver a sermon orally to some audience.
Right.
Whether it's a Alma to his sons or a speech to one of the churches, various, things like that. So
that's a really good point, though, because one of the things you bring up in your paper, and I think this is really insightful, is that they would do this for the reason of being able to remember what's going on. Yeah. And as someone who studies psychology, there's actually a cognitive bias that's actually associated with that, where the
really
to the point where it can sometimes, if people present things as like having a kind of rhyme or having some kind of a literary tool that's assigned, it's almost, people are more likely to take it at face value. Actually, it's called the rhyme and reason cognitive bias, actually.
I have not heard of this. That's really interesting.
It's interesting. I did a little bit of research into cognitive biases when I was doing a series with FAIR on critical thinking skills. But the reason that is, pun intended, is this idea that we have a tendency to latch on to things if we can use some kind of mnemonic device.
Sure.
To be able to help with that. And it can have some unintended effects, but
I still remember kings play chess on fine-grained sand to know about kingdom, phylum, chordata, right? like I still remember that all these years later to help understand, like, you know, and as far as life categorization on Earth, you start with kingdoms, you move all the way down to species. But that's the mnemonic that I was taught in 7th grade by Mrs. Hernishin at Canyon View Junior High. Like, I still remember that. These techniques work to help you remember and understand things and give it more weight in your mind.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, that I can do side tangents too.
Yeah, that works great. No, it's fine. There's give and take on that sort of thing. But no, to your point though, what it demonstrates is this idea that these poetry forms, these parallelisms, these various chiasms. I'm breaking your rule again. They appear.
No, you didn't fight the rule. You talked about all the forms, then you mentioned chiasms.
Okay, yes.
So you're good.
All right. Needless to say, those forms are put in there intentionally, and if they were put in there accidentally, what we would expect to see in this data, we would expect them to appear at almost equal rates in all of
randomly,
these different
more or
genres.
less. Mm-hmm.
And what we're finding here is not that. And there was a really fun number. I want to say it was the p-value of like the likelihood the likelihood that we would find the results that we did if like the Book of Mormon was assembled randomly. So I'll let you kind of talk about that. I won't steal the thunder.
Well, this is where we need to bring my brother in because he did the math. I'm a theologian. Right. We can't even count to 3. That's just part of our that's part of our problem. I'm not good at the math analysis. So I put this over on my brother Stephen, who does have a PhD in demography and statistics from Penn University. So he knows what he's doing. And I just said, so I've discovered these patterns, the percentage of parallel verses. Here's sort of the data. How could we tell if this is intentional or not? We would assume, just because of what we've been talking about, that there would be more poetry in the embedded documents created for oral delivery. How could we tell that statistically?
Right.
And he crunched some numbers, and I don't even understand what a p-value is. And I just said, just break it down to me in like 1 in X percent, chance. Just give me that number. And he basically said, if you wanted to take this many verses and over this many documents and this many genres and showed that the Hebrew poetry overwhelmingly shows up in just these oral documents, that is a 3 in 2,000 chance that is accidental.
Right.
Which, I don't know, again, we can't even count to 3 in my field, but that seems like that's intentional to me.
Right. And the idea behind a p-value, I'll see what I can do, because I've taken statistics myself, but it's the likelihood that we would get the results that we get if there is actually no relationship between, this idea of like them, the oral text actually having more of these parallelisms and these poetry forms than the other texts. So again, very, very small likelihood that we get the results that we get if this was actually accidental, as you mentioned. Yeah. And that's a really, really powerful argument if we're looking at it from that perspective, because suddenly what this means is that critics suddenly, instead of being able to use this accusation of Joseph is making this up, suddenly they have to account for, okay, he's not making this up, or it's very, very, very unlikely that this would have been incorporated into the Book of Mormon if he was just making this up and didn't actually know what chiasms are. He has to be getting this information from somewhere. Yeah. And I think that critics would be hard-pressed to be able to find evidence for that sort of claim, that he's actually knew about these poetry forms, when I think most of the records that we have on Joseph Smith suggest that, I don't think he was stupid, and sometimes I think his rhetorical and literary ability can sometimes be
underplayed.
Underplayed, for sure. And scholars have been talking that for a long time on both sides of the aisle. But
we Latter-day Saints frequently are like, Joseph Smith was so smart, he was so good, and then in the next verse will be like, but he only had a 3rd grade education, and I'm like, you have to pick one. Really? Like, either he was a really smart guy, or I mean, I guess they're not mutually exclusive, but if you're going to emphasize one or the other, you got to pick a lane.
Well, either way,
Sure.
it would still suggest this idea that Joseph needs to be able to have learned this information from
Right.
somewhere. And
So,
you kind of talk about that in additional research that can be done. So I'll let you.
Right. Well, sure. I mean, so basically the question then becomes is does this gentleman in a single draft oral dictation have to create different examples of all 25 of this kinds of poetry, but do it deliberately in ways where it shows up only in these moments of embedded oral documents and not so much in all the other embedded documents, as he's just speaking out loud for the 90 straight days from, April to June that he was dictating the Book of Mormon, on top of creating a geography that is internally consistent, with, I think, one exception, and like all these different things that he's doing. It's just a marvelous production, and it, to me, is evidence that this is not a product of Joseph Smith. He was getting it from somewhere else. I find the idea that he would create, because people have talked about that, right? Did he know about chiasmus? Because that's where most of the work has been done, right? We've focused a little too much on it. Maybe not too much, but we should focus on the others as well and do some work on those. Did he know about chiasmus? Who had discovered it? Where was it known in the world at the time? And I think it was a little bit, but it's a question of whether he would have had access to that or knowledge to be able to then integrate it into this book that he was dictating. What about the other 24 kinds? Would he have had access? Would he have known about those? There's so much going on here that it becomes immeasurably more complicated,
right,
when you're dealing with all of this poetry in this deliberate manner across this book that is dictated orally in a single draft. I think critics have got a problem here.
I think so too, especially if you have to account for how he would have been able to do this, because there are two primary theories of Joseph just kind of architected this work entirely by himself, because that's pretty much what he would have needed to have done, where he's it's for any kind of creative writing. As someone who writes creatively myself, there's architecting this work where you plan plot points out and you think about this stuff beforehand, and then there's discovery writing where you're just kind of making this up as you go along.
Right.
And writers have to, I think good writers have elements of both, where you kind of have to do that sort of thing. But the point I read
some fantasy novels in high school. You got to plan ahead of time, but you can't plan every sentence and paragraph out ahead. There has to be a combination of the two.
Right.
Yeah.
And the problem is that critics would need to decide for this point which one Joseph Smith is doing. Is he making up this 17-line chiasm in the Book of Alma off the cuff and just immediately off the top of his head? Or is he planning that unintentionally beforehand? And what you're saying is it's unlikely that he would have been able to do either one of those if he was fabricating the Book of Mormon himself.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really interesting insight. And it's one of the reasons that I really appreciated the paper and wanted to talk with you about it. But I also think that in your conclusion, you bring up something really, really important about this idea of how we wouldn't necessarily be able to come to a conclusion that the Book of Mormon is true based off of a scholarly consensus or
right.
a specific paper. I'll let you kind of...
Well, you got to read and pray about the book. That's just the first... That's the baseline from which all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and people investigating our church should start from. Read and pray about the Book of Mormon. But I may be unique... and I've discovered, I think, that I am in the church, just statistically, in that we always talk about D&C 8 and D&C 9. The Lord talks about how He'll tell you in your mind and in your heart.
Sure, yeah.
I think I'm 90% mind and 10% heart. It's just the way, and just on a personal note, I feel like I am decades behind understanding how the Spirit works and speaks to me and my idiosyncrasies, because... everybody's always talking heart. And we talk about mind and heart, but then we give mind sort of gets shunted off into the side. And since that's 90% of how I operate, it's been an issue for me. Am I not feeling the Spirit? Am I not understanding this right? But to me now, we can't create testimony through scholarship. I mean, I'm a professional theologian. That is literally my area of expertise, and I am acutely aware of the failings of my area of expertise in creating actual faith that leads to conversion and following the covenant path. But certainly we can use scholarship to bolster faith and testimony that do exist, and we should. And I think more importantly, for those who have a testimony, we can look at the Book of Mormon and use like the data in my paper to say, okay, when they put a lot of poetry into their sermons, it's because they really cared about this. And it helps them to understand and be able to deliver it orally. That's just part of why we have this Hebrew poetry, why these various forms were created in the first place. But we should look at the poetry to see what they were trying to emphasize, what points they wanted to really have a rhetorical oomph. It helps us to get into the minds of these various authors and their testimonies of Christ and of his restored gospel, to be able to look at it and be like, why did they create the poetry this way? Again, a lot of work has been done on Alma 36, where he tells his conversion story, and it centers on, because for chiasmus, the main point is always the middle term. You have an ABC, CBA, chiasmus. The C is usually the critical moment.
Right.
And in Alma 36, he does talk about that was the moment where he reached out to Christ in his agony and was redeemed and felt the love of God and the Savior come to him and forgive him of his sins, and then he begins to work back through the rest of the sort of nightmare that he had created for himself as he's talking to his son. That is the great insight into what mattered for Alma. When you look at the other 24 kinds of poetry, what insights can we gain from looking at all of them, as well as they very carefully crafted these various sermons for their audiences, which now includes us.
Right. And it's one of those things where, as you study LDS theology and history, we've been joking a lot about tangents, but it's one of those things where you can sometimes study these things, and a lot of it ends up kind of like boiling down to trivia, where it's they're like, oh, did you know that in the 1800s the people believed, other people lived on the moon? And they're like, well, yeah, that's some Latter-day Saints believed that, and some non-Latter-day Saints believed that. The guy who discovered the planet Uranus also believed that. Interesting, I didn't know that before. But at the end of the day, kind of like knowing this stuff that I suppose could be chalked up to trivia, that's not necessarily going to give us that belief in Jesus Christ. And that's not going to give us the kind of motivation and the principles and the tools that we need to be able to get through the difficult parts of life. And one of the things that I appreciate about the Book of Mormon is its ability to be able to communicate these principles in a way that helps us come closer to Christ. And I think that's what matters. And I appreciate you being able to kind of bring that up. But that was most of the questions I was going to ask you, unless you have any final thoughts or parting shots on your paper.
Parting shots. I've attacked everybody enough for focusing too much on chiasmus, so we'll just leave it at that. You're all doing great work. Keep it up. Just focus on the other 24 as well, please. I don't know that I have anything much more to add as far as the paper itself is concerned. It's available. I assume we'll put it in the show notes or something from the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies about a decade ago at this point. And it's there for those who would like to look at it and see sort of the patterns that it shows an intentionality in the crafting of the text as a whole, as well as the individual texts themselves. And something that I've appreciated as I've studied, so I did a little bit of biblical studies when I was there during my master's program. And I remember Dr. Holton talking about, he's like, oh, look at this little couple verses here in Luke. Look, that's a chiasm. And I was like, it's an ABBA chiasm. Like that ain't nothing. Let me show you what we got going on in my book. And that was fun. But one of the things I appreciated about the biblical studies that I learned there is that, this is a bit of a tangent as well, but like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all very different gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are, right, the synoptics. They kind of more or less have the same stories in more or less the same order, but to look at the different emphases of the individual authors and how they crafted their story about Jesus and what we can learn about them and their testimony and the audiences they intended it for, helped me understand the Bible more concretely and understand the authors of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John more specifically. And if we can take that same sort of mindset and apply it to the authors, both Mormon as the overall editor, but then the individual authors of these various bits and pieces of the book, in this case, the embedded documents, helps us understand other people's testimony of Christ. I mean, sometimes it's just a letter. You better send me some troops or I'm going to come there and tear you all down, right? So, Captain Moroni's a little bit on the warpath because things aren't going well at that point in the war. But it helps you understand that these were real people, and it helps you understand their particular testimonies and approach to the gospel and understanding and their experiences with Christ. So you can then take it, whatever kernel of testimony they have, and add it to your own. Just to be able to get more into their minds has been, I think, was a great side effect of this paper for me. To really be able to look and say, like, just as a side note, right? So you've got Amalickiah and his brother who leave, attempt a coup, leave, go start, take over the Lamanites slowly over time, and then initiate these massive wars. When these people are writing letters, they use no poetry, and part of me wonders, like, did you forget? You were a well-educated Nephite. I mean, maybe I shouldn't make assumptions about Amaron's literacy, but I assume that he was literate, and he includes no parallelism at all in his letters. Is that a further example of his fall from Nephite civilization to being now Lamanite king, now that his brother's dead? It's just a small detail, but does it help me understand Amaron more? As in this case, as a cautionary tale?
Yeah, I didn't think of it that way, but that's an interesting comment.
Yeah, Amaron is so Gideon High and Amaron, their two letters are the two that have zero parallelism, nothing at all. And Gideon High, he is a robber. We're not really quite sure about his background, where he came from, whatever else. Maybe he's dictating it to a scribe who I don't know. But it seems to me that Amaron would have been well educated, but he doesn't include any poetry in his letter at all. No parallelisms. Really interesting to me. That
is interesting. Can I ask what you're working on now?
Sure. So I'm in the middle of a couple of projects. One with Justin Dyer, who teaches at BYU, on comparing a paper by the Pope called Amoris Laetitia, sort of on Catholic views of family life and proper formation of family and the role of parents and children, all these sorts of things. It's like a 120-page Catholic version of the Family or Proclamation of the World. And we are going to do a bit of a compare and contrast on Roman Catholic approaches to the family with those from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because we and the Catholics are very close to each other in official Catholic doctrine and official Latter-day Saint doctrine, but we get there using very different methods, and that is interesting. And there's another article that I'm working on with some of the editors and interpreter right now. I don't know if it'll maybe end up being a blog post or an article itself, just on the use of the term disciple in the Book of Mormon, just to give you can see where my mind goes, right? I'm doing more math. Basically, there are 55 instances of the word disciple in the Book of Mormon. 48 of them are absolutely clearly references to the Nephite 12 that the risen Christ uses to organize his church. And I basically say, so these 7 other instances that are ambiguous, what if those instances also mean the Nephite 12, not just someone who follows Jesus Christ, right? Because the term disciple, like in the New Testament, there's the disciples. Sometimes that means the whole body of people who follow Christ. Sometimes it means just the 12. Sometimes they use apostles. It's kind of interchangeable. But I'm saying in the Book of Mormon, every time you read that word, you should think of it as a member of the Nephite 12, with one exception that comes from Isaiah. But So more on that as it develops. I just started working on it this week with the editors and interpreter. We'll see how that turns out.
Well, that's really awesome. I certainly appreciate you taking the time to come on in and talk about the work that you've been done. I think it's really interesting, and I certainly appreciate being able to have had a good discussion with you about tangents, piracy, and all kinds of different poetry forms in the Book of Mormon. So thank you, Dr. Cranney, for being able to come in and talk about it. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you, Zach. Take care.
Of course. And for the rest of you guys, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you sticking with us for as long as you did. And feel free to check out the rest of FAIR's work on the YouTube channel and also our website. We also have the conference coming up this summer, so feel free to buy tickets now. But besides that, just be sure to have a fantastic rest of your day.